Hi, how's it going? You have to be living under a rock not to have heard of toxic masculinity. I was rather late to the party. I became aware of it around 3 years ago, not long before the famous Gillette commercial released in early 2019. In that advert, the term was used in a background voice spoken underneath the main narration, but the overall advert took on many of the ideas that fall under the term. What does toxic masculinity mean? It's a pretty slippery term that seems to mean different things to different people at different times. Sometimes it seems to mean specific behaviours that seem to be unique to men, such as wolf whistling or catcalling, or the brash, intrusive antics of drunk guys on a night out, especially their behaviour towards women. All of these are a general laundry list of behaviours that are already covered under the term a bit of an asshole. So, to elevate the idea to more intellectual levels, psychologists and sociologists use toxic masculinity to describe the emotions and attitudes in men that cause these and other behaviours. Things like stoicism, risk taking, competitiveness, physical aggression, or something called entitlement, which is just as vague and nebulous as toxic. Are these attitudes inherent in men, due to, say, testosterone or evolution, or are they socially constructed? If they are inherent, do men need special training to overcome them, or should society just stop putting these ideas into the minds of impressionable boys? The jury is not unanimous over the causes of toxic masculinity, if it exists, but the trial continues as, apparently, something needs to be done about men. But why not just leave men alone? What's wrong with stoicism or risk taking or competitiveness? And why does anything even need to be done about men? The American Psychological Association took this in hand in 2018 when they released their guidelines for the psychological practice with men and boys. They listed the following behaviours and why they are a problem for either the man himself, his family, or society in general. They said, quote, "The main thrust of the subsequent research is that traditional masculinity, marked by stoicism, competitiveness, dominance and aggression, is, on the whole, harmful. Men socialised in this way are less likely to engage in healthy behaviours." End quote. Other quotes are, "Men who accept sexist constructions of masculinity are more restricted by codes of conduct that inhibit their ability to be emotionally vulnerable and form deep connections in adult relationships. Additionally, traditional masculinity ideology encourages men to adopt an approach to sexuality that emphasises promiscuity and other aspects of risky sexual behaviour." Also adding that toxic masculinity compared the health of men and boys and presented a social danger. So toxic masculinity is considered both a real thing and a problem because it encourages an emotionally stunted existence. It makes it difficult to form meaningful relationships. It exacerbates mental health problems, even leading to suicide. It encourages misogynistic behaviour towards women. It encourages male entitlement, especially being sexually predatory. It's harmful to children. Wow. No wonder it's a problem for everyone to be concerned about. Whether all this toxicity is innate or learned, it's clear that traditionally masculine men are a damaged version of an ideal human being. The ideal being a masculinity without much of the masculinity. The thing is, though, we're to believe that all these ideas are new, that this is a long overdue, much needed corrective to an old problem we've lived with for too long. But are they new? Have we not seen all this before? Let's take in a trip in a time machine, shall we? I love this book. It's a collection of artwork from the golden era of pulp science fiction. The pulp describes the quality of the paper, not the writing. In fact, the stories from the 1930s and 40s were very good. But we're here to look at the back pages where the small ads were. Among the items for sale, the novelty gadgets, sex secrets revealed, and saucy novels is an advert for a book too shocking for normal bookstores. You too can learn about the shadow world of the third sex, fearlessly, openly revealing these twilight men and women. Yes, they're talking about gay people. Most people knew of queers, fairies and sodomites, mostly through dirty jokes, but that would have been it. The idea that there was a third sex living in a twilight world was salacious news, and this book would have revealed many unknowns to the public. Even in the 20th century, the most famous gay man of them all would have been Oscar Wilde from the 19th century. Though he was not someone from the twilight world, he was an intellectual socialite, an upper-class flamboyant provocateur. He was untypical of any type of person, though he was typically one of them. Oscar Wilde certainly hit the headlines when he was charged with the crime of sodomy in 1896. It was the sex scandal trial of the 19th century, where equally culpable rent boys were given an amnesty to turn witness for the prosecution and provide the necessary evidence. The evidence didn't stick, and Wilde was found not guilty. However, he was made to stand trial again for the lesser charge of gross indecency, with a lower standard for probable guilt, and he was found guilty. The illegality of sodomy has been in place in England since 1533 under Henry VIII. Strictly speaking, sodomy is not synonymous with men having sex together. Many gay men don't indulge in it, while many straight couples do. But that's an inconvenient detail. Basically, being gay was illegal. The severity of prosecution and sentencing varied a lot through the centuries, but why was it illegal at all? Because, simply, being gay was considered toxic, a threat to society. To quote a judge from Birmingham in July 1954, he was sentencing 28 gay men to prison for, quote, these disgusting practices which corrupt the life of the community, end quote. And these laws remained until 1969. What were the beliefs that supported this judgment? We should look at why gay men were considered to be toxic in the 20th century. A good place to start is this small book by Dr. Donald West, simply entitled Homosexuality, published in 1955. We can see that this is a Pelican book with a blue cover. Pelican books are the scientific imprint of Penguin books, and this was written for mass consumption. The front cover states that this is a frank and practical approach to the social and medical aspects of male homosexuality. And indeed it is. It tackles the subject mostly in an unjudgmental, scientific and anthropological manner. It dispels many of the toxic myths I'll be listing in a moment, and it calls for equal treatment under the law. It's a far cry from the Twilight World book published 10 years earlier. However, it still is of its time. West does use the words invert and deviant to describe gay men, and in chapter 10, titled Treatment for the Individual, begins with the quote, given the choice, no one in his right mind would choose to be homosexual. However strongly they protest their freedom from conventional morality, sexual deviants cannot escape a lurking guilt. The fact that many decent folk regard them as social lepers renders them furtive and unsure, or else forces them into flaunting bravado. Though they wear no visible crutches, their disability is real enough. And this is from a book that spent the previous 9 chapters trying to give a fair account of gay men. So first on the list of why gay men were considered toxic, we have it encourages an emotionally stunted existence. Sex that is physically unnatural is emotionally unnatural. Such men inhabit a twilight lonely world where they find sexual release but no love. It makes it difficult to form meaningful relationships. Men and women were born as two halves of one being, and only together can they feel complete. Men and women can celebrate their togetherness publicly, but a relationship between two men, in the shadows, filled with guilt, is doomed to fail. It exacerbates mental health problems, even leading to suicide. Gay men have always experienced high rates of alcoholism and suicide, though mostly due to public bullying. Even the fair-minded Dr. West considers gay men to bear the burden of a social disability. It encourages misogynistic behaviour towards women. The thinking was simplistic. If you're not sexually attracted to women, you must hate them. You don't need female approval to get laid. By the way, many gay men did grow up with a mother who rejected them. It encourages male entitlement, especially being sexually predatory. Gay men were thought to come in 2 types: the effeminate simp who lusted after real men and who would come on to them aggressively in bars or alleyways. The second type of predatory gay man was the army officer or the scout leader who would use his position of power to abuse men in his charge. It's harmful to children. We all know that gay men and paedophiles were considered synonymous. We've moved on from that, thankfully. What happens when we put this list of why homosexuality was considered toxic in the olden days beside the list of why masculinity is considered toxic in the 21st century, and what do we find? Well, would you look at that? They're exactly the same. Who would have thought it? Guys, you just can't win. You were damned for being too effeminate in the 20th century, and now you're damned for being too masculine in the 21st century, for exactly the same reasons. Moreover, if we look at the list describing gay men as toxic, we see it as archaic bigotry. It is. But we're supposed to look at the new list and think we've gotten it right this time. Apparently, despite looking the same, it's really not bigotry. But the comparisons and the duplicity don't end there. To quote the APA guidelines, psychologists strive to recognise that masculinities are constructed based on social, cultural and contextual norms. Just like masculinity, there was a debate whether was homosexuality biologically innate or socially taught. For most of the 20th century, psychologists were not unanimous, but very biased towards social construction. This is not surprising. Hormones were discovered in 1903, but couldn't be measured until 1935. DNA was posited as an idea in 1869, but it wasn't until 1953 that Watson and Crick built their famous helix model to show how it worked. So, unsurprisingly, with little else to go on, most people opted for the socially constructed model rather than biology. The results were crude. Typical theories for gay men were to do with an overbearing mother, a weak or absent father, or playing with the wrong toys, and not enough healthy rough and tumble, or male-only environments such as prisons, boys' boarding schools, or the armed forces with no access to women. These ideas are scorned today. Anyone trying to cure their effeminate son with plenty of football or roughhousing would be seen as an archaic throwback. Quite rightly, it doesn't work, and all it does is create an unhappy child. Yet these ideas have made a comeback. We are expected to cure masculine boys with plenty of Dolly's tea parties, and roughhousing is especially to be discouraged. And we have to believe that this not only works, but creates a happy child. And for the adults, there is the rightly maligned gay conversion therapy, where gay men go to become more socially acceptable straight men, which, again, doesn't work, and has resulted in a lot of psychological damage. But we are supposed to get on board with male conversion therapy, where men go on retreats to realign their masculine values to something more socially acceptable. There is also a sad similarity in both groups between the glowing testimonies from men who participate and talk about their new selves. And straight men today have seen how far an intolerance of their sexuality can go. Donald West describes an incident from the US in the 1950s which feels depressingly familiar in the Me Too era. An American businessman returns home after an absence. Unaware that a vice crusade, accompanied by much newspaper publicity, was in full swing, he readily accepted a call to the police station. When he got there, the police told him that they had a sworn statement from a man who said he had sexual relations with him. After the police had assured him that anything he said would be strictly confidential, he naively admitted to having the occasional homosexual experiences away from his wife. He was at once arrested and put into jail. 5 days later he appeared on the charge of being an idle, lewd and dissolute person. The lawyer who tried to plead for him was told by the judge, "These men are wanton, all of them, young or old. These pleadings have not affected me one iota." The purge went on. More and more men were arrested, among them one of the city's leading physicians, who promptly killed himself. I've used the term bigotry a few times. One of the litmus tests for a bigot is whether their ideas are just made up to suit their needs, or whether they hold any validity. So we can return to the APA guidelines to see if they have any validity. There's a very good video by Dr. Sean T. Smith that looks under the hood of these guidelines and reveals a lot of intellectually bankrupt source material, but let's have a look at some of the ideas presented up front. The term traditional masculinity ideology, what does that even mean, is used several times throughout the text, such as this quote. For instance, socialization for conforming to traditional masculinity ideology has been shown to limit males' psychological development, constrain their behaviour, result in gender role strain and gender role conflict, and negatively influence mental health. I find this idea bizarre. If we were to make a graph of rates of suicide in men and mental ill health over the recent decades, it would be sadly upward. If we were to make a graph of traditional masculinity ideology over the decades, it would be downward. Men do many things today that were considered unmanly decades ago. We have fathers walking with babies on the streets. We have men hugging themselves in public, crying in public. We have bromances, men cooking the dinner and doing the housework. There is no way anyone could seriously assert that society today has more constrictive expectations on men. Yet we are to look at one graph pointing upward, another graph pointing downward. We're to say with a straight face, oh yes, I can clearly see the correlation. Suicide and the expectations on men are clearly linked. To me, this looks like an inverse correlation. Why is such obvious bigotry against men so easy? I've been showing the parallels between the bigotry against gay men and its new form in toxic masculinity, so the answers might lie there. Gay men have long thought to be of as an evolutionary dead end. They were thought only to be useful in musical theatre and hairstyling. They didn't contribute anything to society and were actually more bothersome and antisocial, a net negative. This seems to have become the status of all men today, with straight men bearing the brunt. What use are men? This seems a bizarre question to ask, yet there is much evidence to show that no one knows what men actually do, never mind why the qualities of masculinity, stoicism, risk-taking, competitiveness are even useful. Let's look at some of the evidence that shows that few people know what men do. 1. Calls for equality. We all know that feminists want equality in the boardroom, political and scientific arenas, etc., but they leave out the most dangerous jobs in the world: truck driving, mining, lumber, etc. Feminists are extremely officious when it comes to seeking unequal gender representation. They don't miss a trick. So if these jobs are off their list, one can only assume they can't even see them. Next, women have every right to be angry. A woman can leave work and travel home some distance on public transport, built and maintained by men, and driven mostly by men, and thanks to all of this, she has a wider access to the job of her dreams. She can unlock her front door, installed by men, and lock it behind her, thanks to the locksmith. She can enter her own four walls and roof, built by men, go to her kitchen and take a drink of clean water, free from cholera and typhoid, thanks to men, from a tap plumbed by men. If it's dark or cold outside, she can turn on her lights and heating, installed again by men. She can amuse herself watching TV or engaging in social media, invented by men. She can never know famine or hunger, thanks to farming technology, invented by men. She can cook her dinner with food brought from around the world by sea and road to a store convenient to her, by sailors and truckers, nearly all men, in a kitchen installed by men. She can go upstairs to her bathroom, plumbed by men, and have a hot shower at the turn of a tap, thanks to men. She can take a dump in a toilet and have it flushed away, out of sight, not in a bucket, thanks to a sewerage system built and maintained by men. And then go to bed, the furniture most likely delivered by men, probably even carried upstairs by men. She can climb into bed and be angry at how unsafe men make women feel. Women have every right to be angry. And then we have the man curfew. This idea hit the headlines in March 2021, thanks to Baroness Jenny Jones in the UK's House of Lords, who suggested it. The idea is actually a few years older than that. A Twitter thread was started in 2018, and if it's on Twitter, it must be true. We all know what would happen if men had to be home by a certain time: the collapse of the air traffic control, the closing of the power stations, the subsequent failure of the traffic system, electronic doors, cash registers, bank machines, domestic appliances that would just stop, street lighting would cease, and the police and firefighters would be decimated. And all this is before the sun sets. When darkness descends, and I mean utter darkness, the rioting, murdering, burglary will begin, as well as fires breaking out all over the city left to burn. I mean, people fall down the stairs in broad daylight and break their necks, or trip over a rug and crack their heads. What's going to happen is people stumble around their homes in darkness, carrying candles, with hardly any ambulances or paramedics to call should they fall. If there was a man curfew at 6 p.m, I would give it until 12 p.m. before the cities begin to look like hell and the rail screaming in the darkness begins. But not these women. Oh gosh, look at the lovely things they would be doing. Midnight jogging through the woods, going to bars alone, taking public transport. Are you kidding me? Who would be driving it? How would it be powered? All of these ideas have hundreds of likes. The cluelessness is mind-boggling. I'm seriously thrown by it. How the hell do these people think anything actually works? I used to think that most people were stereotypically clueless when it came to understanding difficult things like car engines and wiring diagrams. But after reading about their enthusiasm for a man curfew, I can only think that these women, and the men who agree with them, are clueless about every fecking thing. What else can you say? The world, if left to itself, is naturally utter chaos. It's the endeavours, inventiveness, labour and death of men that have tamed it. It isn't perfect, but it at least looks a lot less like the hell our ancestors lived in, and a lot more like the Garden of Eden. However, prevailing ideology today is that the natural state of the world is the Garden of Eden, and actually it's men that are dragging it towards hell, spoiling it for everyone. This is a religious idea called the fall. Feminists, despite revealing how utterly clueless they are as to how anything actually works, feel more than qualified to audit society. They can run through the balance books, up and down the columns, checking the pluses and minuses, and reach a verdict that men are a net negative. Men need to do better. And if they did, we could all live in the Garden of Eden. This is a testimony to the success of men, that the whole modern world looks natural and effortless. I don't know how the electrical grid works or how to drive a train, but it's like a magic trick. If I see a magician perform a card trick, I won't know how he did it, but I'm at least meant to know it's a card trick. I should appreciate the effort that went into making the illusion. What I shouldn't think is that magic is real and that playing cards appear and disappear naturally. And the reason I don't know how it works is that the magician's privilege excludes me from tapping this mysterious force. There is another reason why people act clueless about what men do: resentment. In order to uphold the idea that men have created an oppressive patriarchy for themselves that sabotages the lives of women, you have to create a worldview that supports that in its entirety. If you are unhappy today, despite all the modern conveniences that make life more comfortable, varied, pain-free and healthier, all invented and maintained by men, there's a belief system at your fingertips that allows you to blame men for your unhappiness rather than examine yourself. It's a view of the world marred with a huge blind spot to the amazing success of men in taking the hell of nature and reshaping it to something far safer. Instead, you must be resentful of the obvious net negative contribution that men bring to the world. And resentment is the polar opposite of emotion to gratitude. A world of resentment is one devoid of gratitude. A world of gratitude is one free of resentment. But the idea of showing gratitude towards men has become a laugh-in-your-face, scornful, ridiculous idea. So ridiculous that many men join in, feeling resentful towards themselves and other men, seeking to be cured with male conversion therapy. As a side note, there's a lot to be said about the connection between gratitude, contentment and happiness. If your image of happiness is lying under a palm tree on a little solitary desert island of your own, then the palm tree is contentment and it grows on an island of gratitude. In today's world, many people find meaning and purpose in resentment. It gives them a cause to fight for, a chance to be a warrior, the hero no one knew they needed. They'll find meaning, but not happiness. So, to get back to the uselessness of men, gay men were derided for being of no use. They were seen as emotionally sterile, predatory and promiscuous. They were nothing but sex pests. All men today have been lumped into that category. With no one knowing exactly what men actually do, they have been reduced to little more than physical beings. They are, on average, physically larger and stronger than women, and anything that exacerbates that size or strength is to be shamed. Boisterous tomfoolery, shouting, exuberance, men enjoying their own company, even sitting incorrectly must be reined in. Men are unthinking sexual brutes who need to check their privilege. Little wonder bigotry is easy. What kind of world does this describe? Well, it's time for another trip in a time machine. This time it's H.G. Wells' time machine. Compared to the prophetic writing of George Orwell, poor H.G. Wells is often overlooked, but he was a lot more than an early sci-fi author. In The Time Machine, written in 1895, the hero travels forward 800,000 years into the future. he discovers that humans have separated into the placoid and useless Eloi and the subterranean brutish Morlocks. It's the Morlocks that do all the work and provide the technology that keeps the Eloi fed, warm, docile and clueless. The hero concludes that the lack of danger and challenges have caused the Eloi's mental deterioration. In this story, it is the Morlocks who feed on the Eloi. Despite being the ones who do everything, they are ultimately the bad guys. Well, what's to be done about it? You could dismiss the idea of toxic masculinity as bigoted nonsense and ignore it. There's a good chance you will have watched this presentation with that attitude. But what if that does not describe you, dear listener? What if you're a straight man who believes that you are inherently toxic and that you're trying to do better, and you believe that men are a net negative in the world and should feel ashamed of that and apologise for it, even if you haven't done anything wrong? What can I say to you? I would urge you to think back to the self-loathing homosexual, a term you don't hear much about these days, but it was common even as recent as the 1990s. It described gay men who felt all the shame of all the bigotry that was considered socially normal. They knew they were gay and they hated themselves for it. In other words, under the huge pressure of social bullying, they turned inward and crumpled. I really hope you don't approve of treating people that way. Yet, that's the way men are being treated today. The 2-cent crap psychology, the one-sided ignorant views of history, the blindness to all the good that men do, the outright demeaning insults of mansplaining, manspreading, male entitlement, fragile male ego, etc., etc. This is shaming language, and shaming is bullying. It is emotional abuse on a large scale. The 3 S's, shame, scorn and scolding, writ large. It is very common for bullied people to blame themselves. School kids who think, if only I didn't have acne I wouldn't get bullied. If only I wasn't so fat they would leave me alone. No, bullying is something that is done to you. The fault isn't with you, it's with the bullies. But there seems to be a population of men who have sided with their own bullies and who believe them, and who wear the shame with pride. Men who take this shame and who see it as a burden of guilt they must carry with dignity in order to do better, to admit to transgressions they haven't committed and atone for them, to be better. Not only is this a quasi-religious way to deal with being shamed, but it also reminds me too much of the self-loathing homosexual. If this describes you, then I would urge you to think again. You say no to bullies, you don't support them, and you don't believe the fault is yours. You are not a better, morally superior man for acquiescing to a bully. You are not more manly for carrying the burden they dumped onto you, especially if you did nothing to deserve it. There are many ways to find meaning and purpose in your life. This is not one of them. Why should it be? Even if you have listened this far and you still believe in the idea of toxic masculinity, you still have to question the solution. What kind of Garden of Eden can be created with bullying, scorn and emotional abuse? My advice would be to ask an older gay man what he did back in the 1970s when such social shame and guilt was dumped onto him. In those days, Pride was a civil rights protest and not a corporate shillfest. He would probably advise you, tell him to F off. F off, you bigoted piece of shit. And when you've F'd off far enough away from me so I don't have to watch, take your bigotry, roll it up nice and tight and shove it up your hole. And because you're an open-minded free thinker, tell them it doesn't really matter to you which hole. And with that, I'm done.